All right? But good morning, how are you doing? What a beautiful rain. I had a sense this morning that a lot of people have been believing for a breakthrough in their life. And the word for our year, like the word for our church about to be, was that we would be established. Now, whenever there's a prophetic word, there's always a pushing through into the prophetic word, right? Our verse for this year was Romans 16:25. Sorry, Oscar, I didn't put up there. It says that Paul prayed that God, well, I'll read it exactly. He says, now to God, who is able to establish you according to Paul's gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ. You know that God will establish your life through his gospel, through the power of everything that Jesus has done. And there's a power that comes when you listen to good preaching about Jesus, and it causes us to drive the root system of our life deeper into the love and grace of God, which provides power and fruitfulness for life. And so I believe that, and I don't say this lightly, I believe that for a lot of people this is going to be your year to come into a lot of the things that you've been believing to be established in. And we can sense that, but there's always a pushing through into the things of God. And his pattern is that he would give us a word, a prophetic word, and then and we saw this with Abraham. God said, I'm going to give you a son, and then there was the time to walk into the promise, and then the promise came, and we go, why was the wait so long? And there's many things, and if you're believing for healing, this is a different thing. God always provides the bread of healing, right? But the process we come into the things that God has prophesied into often provide the character we need to carry the prophecy. And so I feel that's sometimes what God does is we push through into the promises of God, and that provides the robustness that we need to carry the significance that he wants for our lives. Anyway, I don't know if that's a word for somebody today. This isn't what I'm preaching about. To say that, this is a time of establishing and breakthrough. And I believe that during the worship as well. Today I've got a word I've called God's path for you. God's path for you. And we're all looking for God's path for our life. That his word is a lamp to our feet. And he has a plan for your life, a plan to prosper you. We really believe that, don't we? That God wants to prosper your life, and he wants to give you a life of purpose and significance. And the more we walk with Jesus, the more significant our life looks. It doesn't always look like the world says significance is, right? It doesn't always look like that. And who knows that that's good. Because what the world gives is empty. What God gives gives us a sense of purpose and significance. And I think that purpose is one of the reasons that a lot of people have problems in our world, because, we're just we're the one-click society. We want gratification very quickly, but it often takes away from purpose. And so often because we're so affluent and we get things so easily, people lose a sense of purpose. But that's all right, because you don't have purpose in the day-to-day sort of accumulation of stuff. You have purpose that God set your life apart for a purpose, for you to be significant. So there's a path that God has for your life. And I want to start we'll pray and then we'll get into the word that I've got. Lord, we just thank you for your beautiful word that you have given us, such a privilege to meet around your word. We just ask you to speak to us today through your word, words beyond what are preached, and that would really do surgery on our soul, that two-edged sword that would divide soul and spirit, so that we would know Jesus in a deeper level than we even do now. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's go to Exodus 13, verses 17. It says, then it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although it was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. This is a famous part of a famous story. The children of Israel have been slaves for about 270 years in Egypt. They've been in Egypt 400 years, and they've been crying out to God to leave Egypt, and it's a very famous story. And God sends Moses, and by the power of the blood of the Lamb, they are released from Egypt. It's a picture of us. We were in the world. Egypt's like the world. We were a slave to sin and the mess we've made it. But God sent Jesus, and by his blood we are set free from Egypt. Not physical Egypt, but spiritual Egypt. Spiritual being slave to sin, being slave to the patterns of this world. And we are released into a life worth living. And all the principles and power of God now works in our direction. How good. But they've just been released from slavery. It's a big moment. And they've got this promise of this land that God gave their forefathers. And it's about an 11-day journey from Egypt. But it goes along like quite a dangerous path. There's a few million people, and they would have not been, it's not like they would have been, inconspicuous. They would have been quite noticeable, you moving this amount of people. And what we find later on is that people aren't okay with that, with them coming into the promised land. There were things that they had to push into to come into the promises of God. But God knew that if he confronted them with those things that needed pushing through, that they would lose heart and go back to Egypt, go back to the ways that they used to be in. So this 11-day journey turned into 40 years, but God leads them a weird way, because if they had seen war, they would have given up on their calling. They're not sure why, but they're walking down to a funnel. They've come out of Egypt, and Moses has said, we're going this way, and the promised land is this way. So they go down this way, and they walk, and they come by this big sea that they can't go over, and so they walk, they come to the sea here. Over this way is a mountain range, and over this way is the road that they came down to get there. And so all of a sudden they're hemmed in. The only way out is really the road they came. Pharaoh decides that he's just not going to let them go away easily. And he sees, it says in the word, that he sees that they're cornered. And he's like, let's go get them. Their path to the water now looks extremely foolish. It has no wisdom in their mind. It seems to be like it seems like God gave them the wrong path. God instructs Moses to stop complaining, stretch out the stick that he has called the rod of God, which is so cool, sounds like a heavy metal band. Stretch the stick over the water. God parts the sea and they go through on dry land. That's just like we're so used to that story, but just think of that in the moment, is that there's been many good theatrical versions of this, but they're in this moment where it looks like all hope is lost, and the path that God had sent them on had sent them into destruction. And really they have three options. They can swim, right? That's not going to go well, is it? Trying to get a few million people to swim across a very treacherous waters. They can run and try and climb the mountains, but they've got chariots and things, and that wouldn't have been, can you imagine everybody trying to make for a mountain pass? Or they can take their fists to a sword fight. See how they fare there. And so they seem to have these three options, and I would say, what is the best option? What is the best outcome of this situation? The best outcome of this situation is that somehow the water would be moved and they could run away. That would be the best option, right? That would be the best outcome, but it seems impossible. Here's the thing. When God sends you on a path, when you mix obedience with faith, right? God is able to do things in a short amount of time that should take a long time. So although they've been hemmed down into I wasn't going to go here this early, but although they've been hemmed into a very restrictive place and they felt like they'd made the wrong moves, God supernaturally was able to open a path that got them where they needed to go quickly, right? But it had to be supernatural. See, faith, right? This is why it's the opposite of works. Because works says I better have done the right thing, and I better have kicked all of the goals and on the right path, and we'll raise up an army. Faith says, leave it up to me, right? And I'll part the waters and I'll get rid of your enemies for you. Faith does things that works can't. Obedience does things that works can't. You see, because God had extra knowledge to them. God had this extra knowledge, and I feel like this is the key to obedience to God's calling, is that God is infinitely smarter than us. We can all say yes to that. But sometimes we feel we would do a better version of God than he does. Right? If I was God, I would have... God, if you were just, then that would be you doing a good job. We would never outwardly say these things. Like, no one's saying I would do a better job at being God than God, right? But inwardly we think, well, if I was God, I would have given me a breakthrough by now. Right? If you cared half as much about people as I do, God, it's like, what are we saying? Right? But inwardly, that can be the attitude we have. But God has understanding we don't have. He actually has all the understanding, all the knowledge. We don't always understand everything that's going on. And that's where trust needs to be developed, because he won't always tell you everything that's going on. Isn't that just unfortunate to us, we feel? However, him keeping those things hidden from us develops the faith we need to come in to the promises that he wants us to come into. This has kind of started quite deep, but we're going to go there. In Proverbs 3, verses 5 to 6, it says, "Trust the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." Right? Lean not on your own understanding. My understanding is that it should take 11 days to get from Egypt to the promised land. That's the understanding that I have. God's understanding is like they're not going to go there and it's going to go well for them. And his other understanding is Egypt at some time is going to try and capture them again. Right? God understands... it says that God hardened the heart of Pharaoh. It doesn't say that God turned the heart of Pharaoh. It said it hardened it. So what Pharaoh was going to do already, God accelerated. I believe Pharaoh was always going to try and come and get him again. Right? So God, in a moment of brilliance, led them to feel like they were hemmed in on all sides. It says he blew with his nostrils. I don't know why the Bible gives you that level of detail. The water parts, they walk across on dry land. Well, that's another miracle. Dry land, it should be sludgy, and you know what it's like at the bottom of an ocean. That must be why it was the nostril thing. I don't know, just blew, and then it just dried it out. And then they walked across, and when they got across, what did God do? He pulled the water back on the Egyptians. So in one moment, God got rid of the single greatest enemy that they would ever have. God disabled the Egyptian army. They say that at that time, I'll give a plug to a channel I follow called Expedition Bible. There's a lot of evidence to show that the army of Egypt suffered an amazing loss, and it was overrun for a while after a pharaoh lost their firstborn to a weird illness, right? Anyway, so God takes out for them their greatest enemy in a moment when they felt like they were going to get overrun. Now, that's also a picture for us. Baptism, that's a picture of baptism, that when you were baptized into the Lord Jesus, it was like all of the world, all of the slavery to sin died, and you were raised together in the newness of Jesus. So God took out their biggest enemy in a moment that they thought that they were hemmed in. And it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, because their understanding wouldn't have come with that outcome. God was going to give them an outcome well beyond what they could even understand in a moment. And actually what God was doing was brilliance. The path that God sent them on was a brilliant path. If you were to say to them in a couple days, right, you're going to be on the other side over here, and Egypt will not bother you again. They would have taken that option, right? If you would but in the moment, what it looked like is we're going to get overrun. So maybe God sometimes puts us in places where he can see a deliverance. He can see a road through the water, a highway through the water, and we don't see it because of our understanding, but maybe God's going to do something that would take you years to understand. Take me years to understand. In all your ways, acknowledge him and he will direct your paths. So what does faith look like? Faith looks like I'm going to walk a path of obedience even though I don't understand, knowing that God has something greater than I understand. Trust in the Lord, not your own understanding, because we don't understand everything. Our understanding is limited. Lean on his understanding. You don't have to know it. You just got to, you're just like, well, I'm just going to lead on his wisdom, do things his way, his knowledge and his wisdom. He directs your path. He directs our path from his wisdom, and we direct our path from our wisdom. He directs our path from his understanding, and we direct our path from our understanding. Now, he is an expert at everything, right? He is the ultimate advisor in everything, so I'd probably rather lean on his understanding. But it doesn't always feel that way. Sometimes you just got to do something because you know. God knew that they would not come to any significance and inheritance if they had gone a normal road. We have the luxury of knowing that God opened the sea and they passed through. They didn't know this was going to happen. You've got to put yourself in the shoes of the people you're reading about sometimes, don't you? Like, what were they thinking? They're like, well, we're about to get overrun. And we stand here going like, how could they not just believe God? Right? Children of Israel, there's a lot of negatives about them, and we're like, oh, they whinge so much. And I'm like, well, put yourself in their shoes. Like, it's like when they complain they had no water. And we're like, oh, they're such complainers. It's water they needed. Like, they weren't saying, oh man, I wish I had a new Ferrari. They're wanting water. And then, but who knows that complaining doesn't get anywhere in faith. Believing and trusting God gets the rock from the water, right? That was the lesson. All they knew is God is leading them down an unusual path, and I'm sure they had no idea what God was doing. In Psalm 77 verse 19 it says, your way was in the sea, your path in the great waters, and your footsteps were not known. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. This is referring to this exact moment and their road through the Red Sea. What the psalmist is saying is there is an insight into God we can learn from the Red Sea moment God had with Israel. There is an insight we can learn from God. Your path was in the sea. It was hidden. Paths in the sea are hidden. So it's not always logical to us. So I just wanted to look at, and we're going to look at this verse a little bit more. Here are 3 insights into God directing our path from the Red Sea moment. The first insight we can get is that God is not into formulas, he's into relationship. This is probably the hardest one because we always have this saying, and it's a good saying, God's not into religion, he's into relationship. But relationship is a lot harder than religion, right? People, like your closest relationships are the most work. But they're the best. But they're the most work. Do you know what I have a relationship, I have a legal relationship with the ATO. Right? I pay my tax, I fill out my tax form, but I never go, yay, I get to hang out with the ATO this July, right? But that's the written law in religion is like, fill out the paper, do the thing, pay the right stuff. But say something like marriage, right? A lot more work, or a relationship you have with your parents or your siblings or even your best friend, who knows, you've got to ring up and check in on them. So that saying, God's not into religion, he's in relationship is true, and it's what our soul is crying out for. But it's not always the easiest one. Like we actually, in the flesh side of us, wants religion. Like, I'll do this, God, then you'll do this. It's transactionary. I'll pay my tax, and then you get off my back. That's how a lot of people view even faith. But the way God is like, hey, come down this road, I'm going to do something amazing. And you're like, you want me to go down to the Red Sea? God's like, yeah, just trust me. It's relational. See, the sea carries no footsteps. What a person on a boat, after a boat goes through the water, very soon there is no trace that they've been there. You can't trace from like picking up cues from the water boats that have been somewhere, can you? The water shifts, there's no wake. The wake doesn't last very long. You can't track ancient maritime routes. You have to have a map telling you where they are. There's no evidence left. You can't follow the tracks of a boat that has sailed 1,000 years ago. You need a navigator. So if you want to go somewhere, rather than saying, well, I'll follow the tracks of people that have gone before me, and there's insights into the principle of God, don't get me wrong, this isn't a foolproof analogy, right? What you need is a navigator to say, go this way, right? So God doesn't always leave a track for us to go from someone else's past experience, but he has left us with a navigator called the Holy Spirit who will direct your paths. So relationally, God will bring you into the right path where you can't just feel it out because you can see the tracks that have worn before. That's why his way is through the ocean. That's why principles work and don't change, but formulas don't. Principles work. What's the principle? A principle is not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit. A formula that doesn't work is, well, I'm going to get up and I'm going to pray at this time, so even though if God calls you to that, that's a good thing. I'm going to copy somebody else's experience, right? God's going to give you a path. We build our lives on God's principles, but our direction and path come through our relationship with him. For instance, if you need a financial breakthrough, I believe in the principle of tithing and sowing and reaping, but where you sow and how much you sow and what you sow is up to God, and he will instruct you how. Where and when to sow and how to reap. Do you understand what I'm saying? I believe in the principle of tithing. It's like Joel talked about. But then if you need a financial breakthrough, I believe that you ask God, where should I sow a seed? And then how much should I sow a seed? And then he'll direct you. I get very nervous about these televangelists that say, well, give me $1,000. There's the $1,000 breakthrough seed. It's like there's no relationship in that, right? Because for some people, $1,000 is well beyond what God's calling them to do, and some people it's well below what God is calling them to do, right? Psalm 103 verse 7 says, He made known his ways to Moses, his acts to the children of Israel. Moses spoke to God. The rest of the nation saw what God did. Israel, to an extent, believed in God, but Moses knew God. When God moved, Moses knew how to follow. You see the difference? Is like Moses had this relational, it says that Moses talked to God face to face. I don't know exactly what that means. I think it means he had a relational, because it also says that no one's ever seen God, right? And so he had this relational exchange where he heard the heart of God and he could he could recognize God in the day-to-day, right? Because he knew him. Whereas the children of Israel are like, wow, God did that. Wow, God did that, right? And there's a difference between seeing what God does and seeing God. And the powerful life is in knowing God. The result of knowing God is that you can follow God. Psalm 41 verse 10, Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you. I'll uphold you by my right hand. My righteous right hand. If you follow God, you will have God. If you meet with God, you will have God. He says, meet with me and I will be with you. And you don't have to have everything, but if you've got God, you've got everything, right? Moving on, the second insight is that the first one was that it's always relational. The second one is it's not always predictable. God is predictably faithful, he's predictably good, but his actions and his instructions aren't always predictable. God's way through the sea was unforeseeable. No one would have ever come up with a plan to open up the water. No one would have predicted that. His ways have a sense of predictability that they are good, but how they express that goodness is up to him. I believe that it's God's good pleasure to shock you with his goodness. It's like, I did not see that coming. And it stops me, like, I like to predict the future. Like, this is what's going to happen, and this is going to, and it never happens that way. Because you turn around the corner, you flip the rock, and you realize that there was a snake there that God was taking care of, right? So your path doesn't always have the same cadence and predictability that we want it to have. The way he decides to do something is wiser, higher, and better than any way we could decide to do it anyway. Isaiah 55 says, "For your thoughts are not my thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." We can be obedient even if it doesn't make sense, knowing that he sees things from a higher place. Whatever he chooses to do is from a higher way of thinking. My ways are higher. God said to Moses, "Tell everyone to move forward. Just stretch out your staff over the sea and divide it." And Moses is like, "Do what?" He'd never seen anything like this before. But he had this obedience to say, "Okay, everyone move into the sea." And as he did the thing, the waters parted. This leads us to our third insight. That the first one is that God is relational. The second one is that he's not predictable. But the third one is that he's very creative. So I don't have to figure everything out because God is creative. In Romans 11 verse 33 it says, "Oh, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out." Paul here is talking about the salvation of the Jewish nation, but I think the principle holds true. It's like, wow, how deep is God's wisdom and knowledge? How creative is he? How unsearchable are his judgments? You can't understand the level God is on, I think is what Paul's trying to say. He's just so much higher, creative. He's on a different plane to us. Like I said, think about it. They could either climb the mountains, take a swim, or fight the Egyptians. However, the best result is that the waters would part and they would go through on dry land. God's creative response to their need is unmatched. And he will find a way to creatively get a miracle to you that you cannot see. Sometimes things happen and you I remember we built a house back in 2019 and I'm really glad that we built it then. But we had this 70s flat roof banger that we loved, house. And I just felt God say, "Sell it." Right? That's all I knew. So we got it ready and we sold it. And we just had a first child. Joe just had Rocco, and she wasn't working, and I was working at a coffee shop, and that was all the money that was coming in pretty much, and the Centrelink payments for having a kid, and so we had not much income. And I remember that somehow we built this house and I remember sitting in the house going, "How on earth did this happen?" I was just sitting there like, I can't believe this. And somehow God made it work. And you know what? He will make you look good. Moses looks good in this story, doesn't he? We know his frailties because we've got a little insight. But when God does something in your life, you're going to look like a genius even though you had no idea what was going on. You're going to look like you need a house. Somehow you're going to look like some sort of property genius, how God gets you in there. You might go like, "Well, there's no entry point for me to get a house." And God's like, "Well, I'll create a water through here. I'll create a path through this water." And then at the end of it, people go, "Wow, that was clever." And you're like, "Yeah, that was clever." And I promise you that whatever you're believing for, if we keep on God's path, we will sit down in the future and go, "Wow, how did that happen? How on earth did God make that happen?" I mean, the best example of this is salvation. It's like there's no answer to the sin problem. There's no answer to the mess we'd made it. Every person before they're saved deep down has a nature that is against God. But then God sent his son. God sent God to take the punishment we deserve so that we could have a relationship that we could never come into. And it actually says in Galatians 4, I think about verse 6 or 7, it says, if they had known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. It's like nobody saw this coming. I want to show you one more insight that just to leave you with something practical to do this week. If we go back to Exodus 13, verse 17, it says, then it came to pass when Pharaoh had let them go, that God did not lead them by the way of the Philistines, although it was near, for God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. They didn't understand that God was going to fight for them. Because God said if they are confronted by a fight, they've never had to fight, they've been slaves. Right? They've never had to fight. If they're confronted by a fight, they won't understand that I'm going to fight for them. In Exodus 14, verse 14, Moses says to them, the Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. What's our job? Hold your peace. Right? What's his job? Fighting. So what did they not understand? They didn't understand that God was going to fight for them, that if they see war, they're going to turn away. What does God say to them? I will fight for you. Exodus 14 and 25, a few verses down, it says, God took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty, and the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. If we are obedient to God's path, he will fight for us. This perhaps is the greatest sense of security that no matter what you face in life, I remember when, again I'm going to talk about my family experience, when Rocco, he's 6 now, when he was born, you know, when you're a new parent, you're just like an anxious wreck about you're checking if they're breathing. And I remember thinking, if something happens to Rocco, God would just raise him up anyway. Do you know that's actually how I came into a sense of calm? It's like, whatever I'm facing, the worst case scenario, even if it happens, God can make it change. God will fight for you. And that's leaning back on faith, to say, God will fight for you. And a saying that we say here a lot, and it's through the Bible a bit, is the battle belongs to the Lord. So when we feel anxious and when we feel like that we have no hope, say the battle belongs to the Lord. I believe that has a calming effect. It does on me anyway. I think about something that's coming up and I start to feel anxious and I say the battle belongs to the Lord. This battle doesn't belong to me. I'm handing over responsibility of the battle to the Lord. You start to feel anxious, the battle belongs to the Lord. If this isn't your verse, get another one. Another great verse is, let not your heart be troubled. You believed in God, also believe in me. Jesus said that. Every time you feel troubled, say the word, let not your heart be troubled. Let not your heart be troubled. Bring yourself back into rest by declaring what the word says about the path you're on. The battle belongs to the Lord. Some people have been facing something for a while, and I'm not trying to minimize your battle, but the word says the battle belongs to the Lord. Some people have said, I've been on this path for a long time, and I feel like, there's no end to where I'm walking. The battle belongs to the Lord, right? And I actually think when we look back, we actually see the providence and provision of God. But sometimes it doesn't feel like that, so we need to remind ourselves the battle belongs to the Lord.